So around 7,000 protesters descended on Newcastle at the weekend from all over Australia to blockade the biggest coal port in the southern hemisphere, Newcastle Port. Teachers, doctors, nurses, workers, students, grandmothers, coal miners even. Children, 7,000. And 170 were arrested under the draconian anti-protest laws of the Minns government. They're doing it around the country, the different states. But that's another story. The big demand from the protesters is no new fossil fuel projects. But what's never much discussed is that we are subsidising these. Yeah, we're paying for them. And not just in climate costs, for future generations, not just in rising insurance premiums, because they're hitting the insurance premiums as the natural disasters ramp up from climate change, not just in the fact that these guys don't pay any tax to extract our natural resources and export them overseas, although, to give them their credit, this time in the annual ATO tax data dump, they did. The likes of Chevron and Exxon, which had skived out of tax for years, they began to pay some tax. They began to pay a little tiny bit of their fair share. But the least the government could do is get rid of the fossil fuel subsidies. I mean, they could stop the new projects as well. I mean, there's 70, 100 years of projects afoot at the moment while we make the transition to renewable energy. Anyway, according to the Australian Institute, these subsidies are now running at $14.5 billion a year. When they started first doing this 5 years ago, it was around about $10 billion. Now it's $14.5 billion. Now, most of that is from the diesel fuel rebate, which farmers get as well, but we've written about on the website about how you could divorce those two and get rid of it for foreign exporters and keep it for farmers. But that's $14.5 billion from our pockets to the pockets of mostly foreign fossil fuel exporters. We even subsidise them for things that don't even work. Now we're talking CCS, or carbon capture and storage. It's a rort. It's a scam. Now, back in 2019, when Scott Morrison, good old ScoMo, was PM, before he appointed himself secretly to the position of Resources Minister, Matt Canavan, who doesn't like climate science very much, Matt Canavan, he was the Resources Minister, and he did a deal with Chevron for the biggest, dirtiest project of the day, which was Gorgon. He called it in the press release a red letter day, that the biggest carbon emitting project was about to set up the biggest carbon capture and storage project in Australian history to trap all those nasty emissions. So it was Chevron's Gorgon gas facility on Barrow Island off the coast of WA. Now, the CO2, the carbon, is taken from the offshore gas reservoirs when they drill it and injected into a giant sandstone formation 2 kilometres under Barrow Island, where it remains permanently trapped. It's a 40-year operation, this one, so the emissions are enormous. And Gorgon is dirty gas. So, Matt Canavan said, when he declared this victorious deal to share some of our taxpayer money with this foreign multinational Chevron, he said once fully operational, the system will inject between 3.4 and 4 million tonnes of greenhouse gas emissions each year into a deep underground reservoir. Well, the only problem is it hasn't. The Australian government's contribution was $60 million towards this carbon capture and storage facility, and it produces the most of any emissions of any project in Australia. It's covered under the safeguard mechanism, therefore, which is the government's initiative to capture the very large fossil fuel emitting projects. So after Chevron's Gorgon, the next one is Woodside's Northwest Shelf project, the BlueScope Steelworks at Port Kembla, and Impec's gas site, and Qantas, its domestic operations. The latest data shows that Chevron's Gorgon gas facility is number one on the latest safeguard mechanism data from the Clean Energy Regulator. But it belches 8.2 million tonnes, nearly 1.6% of Australia's total emissions for the latest data to June 30. Chevron's site says the plant produces 15.6 million tonnes of LNG. It's mostly for export, of course, which has emissions when burnt overseas of nearly 43 million tonnes, greater than the weight of the fuel, because the oxygen in the emitted carbon dioxide comes from the atmosphere during combustion. In this case, the mass is 2.75 tonnes of emissions per tonne of methane gas. So all up, that site is responsible for at least 51 million tonnes of emissions each year. That's a lot. Now, this CCS plant of Chevron's, that we taxpayers have chipped in for, has essentially captured a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of total emissions from the project, about 10 million tonnes of CO2 since the CCS plant was switched on in August 2019. That's versus around 256 million tonnes all up, less than 4% captured. And Matt Canavan said this is the equivalent of removing 680,000 cars from the road each year. That's the PR. But it wasn't. And when you think about it, 60 million on a $3.1 billion project isn't very much. Drop in the ocean. The fact is that why do it anyway? These guys are making a lot of money out of Australia's natural resources. They're not paying much tax. They're exporting most of it as LNG. And the emissions are enormous. CCS, frankly, doesn't work. It's not commercial. If you're only capturing 4%, what is the point? So the least the government can do here, besides ending new fossil fuel projects, because it's got 100 years worth in operation at the moment, is basically just to stop subsidising these guys. There's no need for it. They'll do it themselves anyway. Just police it properly. Do the best. Insist that they have the best projects possible. I mean, CCS 4%, what is the point? Does it really help that much? You can insist on them doing it if they say it's so great, but why should we be paying for it? You know, that makes sense. Thanks for joining us. Please like, share, and comment in the section below, and throw us a few bucks on Patreon if you can afford it.